Welcome to the Becoming Superhuman podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to bring you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
This episode is brought to you by the best-selling online course, Become a SuperLearner. If you're like most people, you probably have a long list of books you want to read, languages you wish you knew, and skills you wish you had the time to learn. This course teaches you how to learn anything and everything faster and more effectively by teaching you not only speed reading, but also an entirely new framework for understanding, creating, and storing memories. To get an 80% off coupon and join over 25,000 satisfied students, visit jle.vi/learn. That's http://jle.vi/learn. Greetings, super friends, and welcome to a very, very special episode of the show. Today we've managed to book, without exaggeration, the world's foremost expert on memory and memory training. We're talking about a living legend who since the late 1950s has sold, get this guys, over 17 million copies of over 40 books. He's been on every major television show you can possibly think of at least once, and he starts those appearances by memorizing the names of everyone in the up to 1,500 person audience. He's been in Forbes. He's coached a long list of Fortune 500 companies and their executives. Honestly, his list of accomplishments does no justice to just what a godfather figure he is in the memory and mnemonic industry. More important than those accomplishments is the fact that he's credited with bringing memory training and mnemonics back into the public sphere, long before the World Memory Championships and long before both myself or my co-authors of Become a SuperLearner were even born. He was putting in the hours to rediscover and improve upon these ancient memory techniques that have helped tens of millions of people change every aspect of their lives through improved mental faculties. You guys, this interview might just be our biggest and most important yet. And that's because there's so much value here. I almost don't know where to start describing it. At 89 years old, my guest pulls no punches and he makes no apologies. And you guys, I think he deserves it. He shares heartbreaking stories of physical abuse and overcoming dyslexia, but also some incredibly inspiring tales of how he became the world's most respected authority on memory, which, by the way, he did with nothing more than a middle school education. You guys will notice right away that my guest is clearly very practiced, and he's spent 60 years in the public spotlight. And that comes out in this interview. He's an incredible storyteller, and he has an amazing way of answering the questions with these vivid stories that pull you in and keep you wanting more. And so, without further ado, I know you guys are excited, as I am, to meet the Yoda of memory, Mr. Harry Lorayne. Mr. Harry Lorayne, welcome to the show. It is such an honor, sir, to have you on the show today.
It's my pleasure, Jonathan.
It's honestly the first time I could ever consider myself in company with such greats as Johnny Carson, and I'm just amazed that we managed to get you on the show, so really excited about that.
Thank you. It's funny you mentioned Johnny Carson. Just yesterday, I'm a terrible computer person, Jonathan, but somebody told me they put one of my appearances on the Johnny Carson show on Facebook. So I'm getting all kinds of emails about it, and et cetera, et cetera. Of course, I did remembering the names of everybody in the audience. I did the Johnny Carson show 24 times over all the years.
My God.
We became kind of friendly. But anyway, my pleasure to be here, Jonathan.
That's incredible. 24 times on the show.
The Johnny Carson show.
Yeah.
Maybe 22 of them, I memorized everybody in the audience. One time somebody was kidding me, or half kidding. They said, gee, you remembered about 400 people in the audience each time, and you did that about 22. Wow, you must have met about 4,000 people on that show alone. So I said, yeah, right. Now my problem is to forget them all.
Yeah. Exactly. You got to do that spring cleaning and get it all out of there, make room for new content.
Well, like I always said, remembering is not my problem. Forgetting is.
Interesting. So, Harry, I want to get into the method. And of course, given my background in accelerated learning, I really want to dive into how you do that. But first, I think we should give our audience a little bit of background information, which is you've been in the field of mnemonics and memory way before it was fashionable. And in a sense, you really blazed the path by yourself to bring this stuff to the popular consciousness. Tell us a little bit about that process and what you discovered to cause your life path to head down this course.
Somebody once asked me on television, how does these dems and those kids from the Lower East Side of the mean streets of New York City with one year of high school, etc., how does somebody like that become the world's foremost memory training expert? Is that what you're asking, Jonathan?
That is what I'm asking. I bet you remember what you answered.
Well, I do, because I also, I recently put out a memoir called Before I Forget, which is a good title. Mel Brooks told me to call it a re-memoir. Anyway, reason I mentioned that is that this is going to sound kind of redundant to the people who have bought Before I Forget, because I told this story there. But if you want to hear it, I'll tell it to you anyway. I was on television once when the host said to me the question I just asked, how do you become the world's foremost memory training specialist? And I said, stomach cramps. And he said, what? He turned white under his makeup. He thought I went nuts, And I said, no, let me explain it to you. And what happened when I was very young, I'm talking about 11 years old, I had stomach cramps every morning. I thought that was life. I thought that was the norm. Till I realized that I had those stomach cramps only Monday through Friday. I didn't get them on weekends. In other words, school days. And then I started to realize why. Because we used to get a test, a 10-question test, every day in school, and the teacher, her name was Mrs. Goldfisher, I'll never forget her. She used to, she would grade them and give us back the papers, and we had to take them home for at least one parent to sign them. And my father, who died when I was 12, so you can see how far back I'm going, was the signee. And I was getting failing grades every day. 40s and 50s, where my little classmates were all getting passing grades, 70s, 80s, 90s. Anyway, I would bring home this test for my father to sign, and he would see the failing grade, and he would punish me. He would hit me. Jonathan, once on the Johnny Carson show, I was telling the same story, and I said my father punched me, which is really what he did. And about 10 or 12 days later, I got a call from Freddie DeCordova, who was the producer of the Tonight Show. And he said, oh, Harry, we got thousands of pieces of mail about your visit here, and they're all negative. I said, why? What did I do? He said, well, you said your father punched you. You can't say that. So now, when I tell this story, I say my father punished me. That's okay. So my father punished me. Anyway, I'm telling you this whole story to tell you that I was getting stomach cramps because I was afraid that my father was going to punish me. So I didn't know what to do till one day. Oh, boy, talk about a pivot point or a plot point in your life. One day, the light bulb in my head went off, and I said, there's only one way to stop my father from punching me or punishing me, and that is to get passing grades. But how do I get passing grades? And that's when the light bulb got brighter, Jonathan. I said, all I got to do is remember the answers to the questions that Mrs. Goldfisher asks. But because in those days, the kind of questions you got on the test when you're 11 years old in those early grades, they're not the kind of things you can intellectualize, which is not a word I knew at that time, but I could understand it in my mind. All I had to do is remember them. How do you intellectualize a question like, I'm trying to think of one that she gave a question she wanted. Oh, what's the capital of Maryland? Well, how do you remember that? That's Annapolis. There's no way to intellectualize it. That's my point. Either you know it or you don't. And as I once wrote in a couple of my books, the word know, remember, and learn are all synonyms. If you know something, you've learned it. If you've learned it, you remember it. If you remember it, you know it. And so on. They're all synonyms. That's what started it, Jonathan. I went to the library. I asked the lady if there were any books that teaches you how to remember. She took me to a room where we had to wipe the cobwebs off the door. Nobody had been in there for 100 years, And she took me to a corner. There were books dating back to the 17th century, some of them, some are now in my private library, on memory training. And you've got to understand, again, that I was 11 years old, and I'm also dyslexic, and as I get older, it gets worse. But I was dyslexic when I was a boy. That's why it ends up I was getting lousy grades. They didn't know the word dyslexic. Well, maybe they knew it, but they never used it. At least my teachers didn't know it, and I never heard it, certainly. But I learned about it later. Basically, what happened when I was a little boy in school, they give you the name, you play the game. They stamped me moron because of these lousy grades I was getting. So I went along with it. I thought that's the way I was. But anyway, to get back to the story, I was only 11, so I couldn't remember, I couldn't understand most of the things that I read in these books on memory. But the small percentage, the 0.10 or 0.01% of the things I read that I did understand changed my life. And then all of a sudden I started to apply it to my school. I didn't realize that what I was doing was changing things, manipulating the few things I did understand to apply to remembering the answers to these questions. That's all I cared about at that time. That's the point. I didn't want to get hit by my father. So I started to twist them and manipulate them. I didn't know I was doing something brand new with some of these things, changing them to fit my particular problems. And I started to get hundreds on these tests. I remember Mrs. Goldfisher stopping me one day when I was coming into the room, and she said, "Harry, what happened? Now you're getting grades that I always expected from you. What happened?" And I started to explain. Like, she said, "Well, what do you mean? Give me an example." I said, "Well, let me use the Maryland and the capital of Maryland, which is Annapolis example. There was a girl named Mary in the class, and I pointed to her, and I said, well, I visualized Mary, and I saw an apple landing. Mary, land, and an apple is landing on her head, Annapolis. So that's, and I said, I visualize an apple landing on Mary, and that's how I remembered Annapolis. And as I explained it to Mrs. Goldfisher, I saw the curtain come over her eyes, and she said, all right, Harry, take your seat. You know, she thought I was nuts. So at that point in my life, I stopped telling people what I was doing and how all of a sudden I was getting better grades. Except as time went on, my little classmates started to ask me. They said, Harry, what are you doing? I explained it, and they started to use it, but we didn't tell the adults about it. That didn't happen until a decade or more later. So I think I told you more than you wanted to hear, Jonathan, but that's basically what started the whole thing.
It's an incredible story, and it's certainly not more than I wanted to hear, because it's really, I appreciate you sharing it with us.
Like I say, I've written that story. It's true. It was a major part of my life, obviously. As I say, it was a pivot point to change my life. So, yeah, it's important to me, and I wanted to tell that story.
Harry, what were those techniques? I'm sure, obviously, you've built upon the techniques. You've innovated in this field as well. But walk us through. Much of the audience comes from my SuperLearning course, where I teach a little bit about memory palaces. I teach about visual memory and creating the symbol of Mary and an apple on her head and the marker around that. But walk us through, what are the techniques that have made you world famous for memory?
Well, basically, listen, all my stuff is based on original awareness and the reminder principle. They're the two things, really, the basis of what I teach. And I made up those phrases because I realized how important they were. Original awareness. Well, let me give you an example. The universal memory complaint is I'm introduced to somebody, and a minute later I forget his or her name. And I've written this so many times, I say, that's a lie. You didn't forget his or her name. What you did is you didn't remember it in the first place. And that's what I'm talking about, original awareness. I mean, I've seen that. I've written about this again. I've been talking to somebody at an affair I go to before I was known, and I would see them looking over my shoulder, looking around the room, not even paying attention to me, looking for who could be more important in this room for them. And people do that, sometimes not realizing that maybe the the person whose shoulder they're looking over and not making contact. That's the most important person in the room. So what I'm trying to say, again, you didn't forget the person's name. You didn't remember it in the first place. And that's what I teach. And that's the way I remember up to 1,000 people, which I don't do anymore because I learned that could be a bore. If I remember 400 people in the audience, I don't want people to think, well, what else do you do? So remembering 400 people is strong enough. I think it makes the point,
Yeah.
It's like I said on that Johnny Carson show, people ask me, why are you teaching me how to remember hundreds of names at a time? I don't mean 100 people at a time. And my answer is, no, of course you don't. I do it because I have to in an appearance. But what I'm teaching you, it's like swinging 3 bats to make it easier to swing 1. If you could do that, what I'm teaching you, then obviously you'll remember the names of the few people you meet in your business and your social life.
Sure. And everything else. I mean, if you read a book, you can remember all the details.
Well, it's an entirely different concept, an entirely different system. Names and faces is one thing. I teach people how to, first of all, visualization, as you mentioned before, is very important in memory. And I teach people how to remember, how to visualize anything, how to visualize any name. How in the world do you visualize a name like Bentiveglia, which is a person I met years ago? Bentiveglia. It's an Italian name, and maybe it has meaning in Italian, but I don't know that. So I had to make it meaningful. When I say visualization, you cannot visualize something that has no meaning. I mean, how do you remember the digit 5? All it is a concept. It's one lower than 6 and one higher than 4. So what I teach is how to visualize anything, how to visualize any name, how to visualize any foreign word, which is the same as a name that has no meaning. So those are the important things. Visualization. First, you have to visualize something before you can associate it to the thing you want it connected to. All memory boils down to 2 items, 2 things. A name to a face to a name, a telephone number to the person that owns that number, a foreign word to its English meaning. Always boils down to 2 things.
Mm-hmm. And everything becomes connected and everything becomes visual in some way.
Well, there goes the reminder principle that I mentioned before. You have to know how to make one thing remind you of another. When I remember 400 people in the audience, I look at the face and that tells me the name. The face reminds me of the name. And if I thought of the name without looking at the person, it would remind me of the person's face. That's the reminder principle. I want to connect the foreign word pamplemousse to grapefruit because that's what it means in French. And I remember when I went to France 100 years ago and I couldn't speak French at all, even though I took it in school and it didn't register at all. But as I went to France every year many times now, I speak a little French, but at that time I didn't, and I wanted to remember how to order in a restaurant. So that's why pamplemousse just came to mind. So when I think of grapefruit, when I'm in France, I want to be reminded of the word pamplemousse. So that's the point. That's the reminder principle.
Incredible. So you mentioned that different fields of learning have different adaptations. How would you memorize, say, highly technical, medical, or mathematical information, maybe mathematical formulas?
Well, I've written books on that subject.
That is a good point.
Yeah, listen, in 1972, I wrote a book called Good Memory, Good Student. That took students up to and into high school level. And then the publisher said, can you bring it higher to, let's say, to college level? I said, sure. So first there was Good Memory, Good Student to high school level. Then there was great super memory successful student. That was up to college level. And then years went by at a Little Brown publisher, which is a pretty big publisher here in the States, said, can you condense those 2? That one was written in 1972, the other one in 1973, said, can you condense them into one book? I said, sure. So that became Super Memory, Super Student. And that's available now. And there are 2 chapters in that book where I teach formulas. Mathematical equations, formulas, etc., among other things, among language, etc. Matter of fact, somebody asked me about it just recently, and I have a copy here on my desk, and I was going to read some of the chapter headings to you, but, it goes on and on. I don't want to take that time. But obviously, numbers remember them now on and forever. Vocabulary, you can remember words and definitions easily. Foreign language vocabulary, testacio, which means very easy if you didn't know that. Names and numbers and dates and presidents of the United States and American history and so forth and so on. Even how to remember music, which I'm terrible at when I use my systems. And how to make no mistakes when you spell. And, of course, here's the chapter we're talking about. Chemistry, biology, and genetics. Tables, laws, theories, and other toughies. So and another one is more formulas. Algebraic, chemical, and structural formulas, molecular compositions, electronic dot diagrams, etc. So all these are memory problems. You know, I mentioned the two books I wrote on students, Jonathan, back in 1972, and my publishers made arrangement with the Bronx High School of Science here in New York was, and I assume still is, considered very high-level high school, and they made arrangements to allow me to come into the school after classes, right after regular classes, to interview whoever I wanted to, for the book. And that's what happened, and I made a big mistake. The mistake being that I started to interview the teachers first, Jonathan. And again, I've written about this because this was very important to me. Every teacher I spoke to said, no, we don't use memory. We use doing and concepts. Now, I know what the word doing means, and I know what the word concepts means, but I didn't know what the phrase meant. I didn't know what they were talking about. And they all insisted we don't use memory. I remember talking to one teacher, a lady. We were in a classroom all by herself, and there was a large blackboard on one wall, and the periodic table was on that wall. Do you know what the periodic table is, Jonathan?
Of course.
Okay, so I said to this teacher, and incidentally, they were all kind of upset with me that I was talking about remembering, because they all said, no, we don't use memory. So anyway, I said to this teacher, listen, I've been out of school for quite a long time, which was true. And I said, so forgive the silliness of my questions. I noticed you have the periodic table on the blackboard here. Do you still teach that? She said, of course. I said, well, if you teach it, do you still test your students on it? She said, yes, of course we do. I said, so let me ask you a question. Is it still the same as it used to be when I went to school? There are only two ways I can think of when you test on something like this, and that is fill in a blank or multiple choice. She said, yes, those are the way we test now. Either fill in a blank or we give you a few choices. You got to pick out the correct one. I said, okay, so let me ask you a question. What mental calisthenic would a student have had to use if the question was, what is the symbol for iron? And there was a blank. And if they put in the letters RJ, what would happen? She said, well, they would get a wrong mark. I said, and that would affect their grade, wouldn't it? She said, of course it would. So I said, well, again, could you tell me what mental calisthenic that student would have had to use in order to put in that blank? What is the symbol for iron? In order to put in FE. And, Jonathan, it took me 10 minutes to get her to say, oh, well, they would have had to remember it. So that's the point. I went into another class after speaking to this lady. This was a male teacher, and he had just given out the textbooks for that class. And he made a statement like, the next class, I would like you all to know the information on page 8 to 10. And when, after all the students left, I talked to him, and again, at first he said, no, we don't use memory. I said, but you just told your students to know the information on pages 8 to 10. Again, what do you call that? And again, it took me 10 minutes to get him to say, well, they have to remember it. Of course they do. But, you know, in one of my books, on the front page, I said, there is no learning without memory. And that caused such screaming among educators here in America. And there were so many debates that I got involved in with them, and I have yet to lose that debate, Jonathan. You know why? Because there is no learning without memory.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. One thing I do want to ask, where do memory palaces come into these techniques that you were teaching for these students?
Nowhere. I don't use memory palaces. Jonathan, you've gone back 3,000 years. It was a wonderful system. You know, I have a couple of websites. I have a lousy computer, but I have people do it for me. I have one website called memoryimprovement.org. And in that, First of all, as soon as you go in there, you see a great picture of me, which I don't really like. But the reason I mention it is I go in a little bit of the history of memory about books going back to the 1600s and 1700s and how the memory experts at that time, because there were very few note-taking devices at those early years, and that these people, for speeches, they used to use their homes as the memory palace. In other words, they would associate, it was called loci, some people pronounce it loci, I don't know which is correct, I guess it's according to where you're from. The word L-O-C-I, it means places, and they would associate the first thought of the speech to the first place in their home, the second thought of the speech to the second place in their home. You know, going over through the mists of time, that's where our cliche comes from, in the first place and the second place. So I know all about that, but it was limited. It's 3,000 years old. The systems I teach now are hundreds of thousands of times better.
Really? So tell me about those. I'm dying of curiosity.
Well, I mean, you know, there are different ways of applying my systems. It's according to what you want to remember. You want to remember numbers? That's one system. It's my peg list. You want to remember faces? Well, I talked to you before about making things meaningful. I mentioned the word Pennsylvania. How do you remember? How do you remember the name Pennsylvania? How do you visualize it? It has no meaning. It's a conglomeration of sound. Well, I teach my students to use this example. I hate to go out of context, Jonathan, but I'll talk about this for a couple of seconds. Okay, let me give you one of my cliches. Even if my systems don't work, they must work. Of course, they work beautifully, but even if they don't work, they must work. Now, I know that sounds contradictory and silly, but no, it has good meaning. You know why? Just trying to apply my systems forces you to grab your mind by the scruff of its neck and tell it, darn it, pay attention. That's the key. Pay attention. Okay, in order to make the word Pennsylvania mean something in your mind, what can you make it mean? What does Pennsylvania sound like? Well, to me, it sounded like a bent weather vane. You know, the thing that has northeast, west, south, N-E-W-S on it. A weather vane, bent vein. Well, that has meaning. I can visualize a bent vein. You see them on roofs, etc. I can visualize that, but here's the key to that silly remark of mine, that even if my systems don't work, they must work. In order to do what I just said, to make Pennsylvania in your mind think of bent vein, you had to do something that most people don't do, and that is listen.
Yes.
You had to hear the name before you could make Pennsylvania mean bent vein in your mind. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And now the next thing is, okay, you've just listened. You know the word bent vein, and that will remind you, there's a reminder principle, will remind you of Pennsylvania. How do you tie it to this person? How do you tie it to his or her face? Well, let's say Mr. Pennsylvania has the first time you look at him, the first impression, and remember, first impressions are lasting impressions. That's part of the key. He's got a big nose. That's the first thing you notice. And again, even if my systems don't work, they must work. In this case, you know why? Because, again, you had to do something that most people don't do, and that is look. You've listened to the name. You've looked at the face. You've paid attention. In order to find the outstanding feature on his face, you can't look over his shoulder. You got to look at his face. Well, you picked out the big nose. Now, those are the two steps. Number one, listen. Number two, look. Now, the third and most important step, how do you tie the two together? There's association. I looked at the person's face, and while I'm shaking hands, I visualized not his big nose, but a bent weather vane instead of a nose. That's it. The next time I meet that person, I look at his face and I say, hi, Mr. Pennsylvania.
Incredible. And that's something we talk about in our course, is creating the meaning and attaching things to something that actually has relevance for your mind.
Well, you know, that's what I've been teaching. Let's see, my first book, How to Develop a Super Memory, I wrote in 1954, was published in 1956, has sold 8 million copies. That was 1956 it came out. I have started an industry, Jonathan.
You have.
I know you teach it. There are hundreds of people teaching my systems or trying to.
And we owe it all to you. We really do.
Well, listen, I don't want to say it, but you know what I get from most people, Jonathan, honestly? If I say anything, which I don't do anymore, I don't want to get involved, but if I say anything, it's, oh, listen, Memory Sisters were around long before Harry Lorayne. Yeah, that's right, 3,000 years. But these people weren't around before Harry Lorayne. They all came after 1956, after my first book.
That is absolutely true. Harry, I want to ask, one of the things I think a lot of people struggle with in the digital age, we all have computers nearby. We all have our smartphones. People feel that they don't need to remember. And I often am challenged by people. Why do I need this skill? How can I apply this skill? I mean, I don't need to remember phone numbers. I have them all in my contacts list.
Yeah, except God forbid you're in an emergency and you can't get a signal, and then you sure as hell better remember your number.
Exactly. And that was the question I wanted to ask, which is, what are some of the most impactful things you've remembered and used your techniques for over the last, 60 years?
First of all, the first part of your question, years ago, I have a son who's 46 years old now. And when he was a little boy, he came to me all those years ago and he said, "Oh, Dad, would you get me a calculator?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, why not? The guys and girls in my class have calculators." And what was going through my mind, my kind of imagination, I'm visualizing it's 50 or 100 years in the future, and the main battery in the world goes off, and somebody says to somebody else, "How much is 2 times 2?" And he says, "I don't know," because all of a sudden you got to have the calculator, you got to have the computer. And that's one of the problems with these things. People are not using their memories, which, is not good for a variety of reasons. But one thing I wrote years ago, if you let your right arm hang down and you don't use it for 6 months, it's going to atrophy, and you won't be able to use it again, ever. The same thing holds true for your mind, which is probably more important. You don't use it, it's going to atrophy, and it's not going to do you any good. It won't work for you anymore. So I don't like this idea of not having to remember anything because of our new technology. I'm still working on the crystal radio, Jonathan. I'm a terrible computer person. I don't use these things. I want to remember numbers. I don't want to have to go into the system or the little thing you're holding in your palm to give me a number. I know the numbers. Now, that's my individual thinking. Listen, I think it's a great idea. My son walks around with this thing in his palm, and my adorable little 3-year-old granddaughter is starting to do it, for God's sakes.
Incredible. Yeah, I mean, our generation was born with these devices in our hands.
Exactly. I think in one way it's very nice, but in another way, and maybe a more important way, it is not. We had a whole conversation that in schools, they're not even teaching kids handwriting anymore. Well, how could that be? How are you going to sign your name, for God's sakes? So, in a couple of my books, I wrote, for every bit of progress, there is sometimes a step or two backwards.
Yeah, I guess that's probably the case with handwriting.
Yeah, I mean, how can you not teach kids handwriting, for God's sakes? I mean, okay, I know I'm older, etc., but, I've written almost 50 books, Jonathan, and I'm going to keep doing it until I get it right. But I've written almost 50 books, about 29 or 30 in the art of card magic, which was my first love, and the rest on memory for the public. And all of them, I handwrite first.
Wow.
If I couldn't handwrite them, I couldn't write them. So that's the way I do it. I'm not saying that's the best way or if that's what every writer does, but that's what I do. I handwrite them. Then, the last few books I wrote, I did on the computer, but it took a bunch of people, friends of mine, talking me into it, and it still scares the heck out of me because I'm a first-time writer in handwriting. Then I used to type it on the old Royal typewriters, where you had to have strength in your fingers to do it. Mm-hmm. And obviously that's changed with computers. So now as I go into the computer with what I've handwritten, I edit as I type it in. And like I say, I'm a first-time writer, and computers scare the heck out of me. I don't want to have to write it again. So every chapter I write, A, I send it to somebody who archives it for me, and B, I print it out. I don't want, in case the computer crashes on me, I don't want to lose what I've written.
Of course, and that's a great habit to have as well.
Oh, yeah, it scares the heck out of me, so I'm very careful about that.
Rightfully so, I would say. I think we've all lost files in the past.
Listen, you know what changed my life? Let me give you a little story. I don't know how much time you have.
I have all the time in the world for you, Harry.
All right, I'll give you another pivot point. I mentioned to you fleetingly before that my first love was card magic. That changed my life. Okay, I was the shyest. Most people that I talk about this, they laugh. They say that can't be. I was the shyest kid in the world. I mean, shy to the point of sickness. Like mother, like son. I got it from my mother. She was the kind of woman, if she was on a railroad track and a train was coming, she'd be too shy to yell help, for God's sakes. And I was the same way. I never made eye contact. I never spoke to people unless they spoke to me first. Until, again, when I was about 10 and a half, 11 years old, a park counselor. We used to go there after school to play shuffleboard and ping pong and things like that. Not ping pong, play outside paddle tennis. So one day it was a rainy day and he didn't know how to keep us occupied, so he showed us a card trick. Mm-hmm. That changed my life because in my mind I said, oh boy, if I could do that. And I was too shy to ask him how he did it. Of course, I didn't realize that you don't ask somebody how he did a trick. They're not going to tell you anyway, you know. But anyway, I ran home. I stole some milk bottles, bring them in for deposit, 2 pennies each. So I could buy a deck of cards and see if I could work this trick out. And I did. And the reason I mentioned this, how that changed my life, because it took me out of that terrible cage of shyness that I was in, because now, when I never spoke to anybody before, I had to say at least 3 words. If I wanted to do a card trick, I had to say, pick a card, for God's sakes. I had to talk to people. It just changed my life. Now, I started to become very good. Well, I must be. I've written 29 books on the subject. But going back many decades, when I was about 18, 19 years old, I was doing what's called table magic in a nightclub. It was Billy Reed's Little Club, it was called, where I would go from table to table and do magic for tips, okay? And most of the stuff I did was card stuff. But remember, I was about 19 years old. And one day, a famous actor, well, famous at the time, his name was Victor Jory. I don't know how many people know it now. Victor Jory played Helen Keller's father in the movie Miracle Worker, in which one of my closest friends, Anne Bancroft, who died many years ago, but she got her first Academy Award in 1962 for playing Helen Keller's teacher, Annie Sullivan. Anyway, Victor Jory played father. He was well known at the time. Anyway, he came into the little club with a friend, a lady friend, and he asked for me. It seems he was interested in magic, and I did some stuff for him, and he liked it very much. You know, a few days later, he came in with another friend, a male friend this time, and he said, Harry, I want you to do some of these things for my friend. And one of the things that I wanted to do with Victor Jory, because he kept coming in, this happened 3, 4, 5 times, I wanted to do at least one trick each time that Mr. Jory hadn't seen yet. And that's what I was doing. And the reason I'm telling you this, eventually it got to the point where I ran out of tricks to do. It's different now. If you hand me a deck of cards, I can go on forever because I make things up as I go along, but not when I was 19 years old or around that time. So I was running out of things to do, and I had been interested in memory work privately, personally, and one of the things that I did was card memory, to remember cards. And I said, all right, look, I'm running out of sleight of hand tricks to do for Mr. Jory. I'll do the memory thing. To me, it was like scraping the bottom of the barrel, you know? Mm-hmm. So anyway, I did it. Now I'm going to explain the trick. I have Mr. Jory pick up the deck, and I say, Mr. Jory, would you shuffle the deck thoroughly? He does. I say, now call him off to me pretty quickly, so at least so I understand him. And he did. In about, 1, 2, 3, at about that speed. He calls off the whole deck. And now I would say, Mr. Jory, give me any number from 1 to 52. He'd say 17. I'd say the King of Hearts. He would count to the 17th card, and I'd say, don't mix them up, but count to the 17th card. Sure enough, it was the King of Hearts. Or I would say, give me any card. And he would say the 4 of Spades. I'd say that's the 32nd card. He would count to it, and there it was. I did that a few times. And then finally, the end of the trick was, Mr. Jory, do you play poker? Yes. What is the best hand you can get in poker? He said, a royal flush. I said, okay, give me a suit. Clubs, hearts, spades, or diamonds. He said, spades. Okay, I said, would you look at the 14th card, 18th card, 23rd card, 42nd card, and the 51st card? He did, and there were the 5 spades, the 10, jack, queen, king, ace of spades.
Incredible.
Why am I telling you all this? When I finished this trick, Victor Jory stood up, started to applaud, and in a loud voice, everybody could hear. Remember, the name of this club was the Little Club, so people were able to hear him all over the club. He said, Harry, the sleight of hand you've been doing for me for the last couple of weeks, the best I've ever seen, fantastic, but what you just did, and he started to rave about the memory, Jonathan, and that changed my life, because in my mind I'm saying, wait a minute, he's more impressed with the memory work than the sleight of hand I've been working on for years. That changed my life. I realized that performing or doing memory for people was more important than doing card tricks.
And probably more meaningful and applicable. I mean, you've changed tens of millions of people's lives.
I get letters from people you can't believe. People on one of my infomercials that I mentioned before, and if you go to my, again, I'm very naive with computers. I guess you call it my site. It's harrylorayne.com, where it explains about the memory power course. One of the testimonials, I have a few testimonials from lawyers and doctors who said they couldn't become lawyers and doctors without applying my system. But there's one, I'm proud of all of them, but one of them, his name is Bob Norland, Norland. I know it very well because I flew to California to interview him when I got his letter, because he said he had a stroke when he was 75, and the doctors told him that one of the things, unfortunately, he would never be able to remember anything again. And he said, somebody told me about your memory course, Mr. Lorayne, and now, listen to this, my memory is better than it was before the stroke. He said, as a matter of fact, I do memory demonstrations for my Toastmasters Club. So I flew to California, arranged for a couple of camera people, so I can get them on film, and that became one of the testimonials on my infomercial. Listen, when I was first introduced to, I'll drop a few names, Jonathan. I don't know if it works in your area of the world. I was introduced to our then Secretary of State, Colin Powell. Mm-hmm. He was do you know that, Jonathan?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, he's the Secretary of State. When I was introduced to him, I'm quoting now, he exclaimed, Harry Lorayne, and he threw his arms around me, and he said, Harry, you helped make me a general. And I was too much in awe to say, would you put that in writing, sir? But that's what he said, because he used my systems. The mayor of New York, the ex-mayor of New York, Mike Bloomberg, uses my systems. The ex-police commissioner of New York, Raymond Kelly, uses my systems. There are so many politicians, a lot of them tell me, don't mention my name, because they don't want it known that they have great memories because they use the Harry Lorayne system of memory. And I ask them why. They say, well, we can never sit at a congressional meeting or a Senate hearing, and when we're asked questions, we can never again say, I don't remember. People know who we use your systems.
Yeah.
I'm under blood oath not to use their names, but there's so many politicians that use my systems, and doctors and lawyers and people all over the world. And the nitty-gritty about people who have had strokes, and some people have told me, and I'm very careful when I say these things, Jonathan. Let me say again, I'm not a doctor. I had 1 year of high school, so I don't know. But I've had other people who apparently or supposedly do know tell me that applying my systems can conceivably hold back Alzheimer's. Now, I don't know whether that's true. Let me repeat again. I'm not a doctor. I get old. I threw out many years ago when I moved out of New York City, and I lived in a 3-story townhouse, many cartons of letters, because, most in those days it wasn't emails that I get nowadays, testimonials. They were snail mail, that I had kept, that I threw out cartons full of them from people all over the world who tell me I saved their lives with my memory system. So, that helps make it all worthwhile, Jonathan.
Incredible.
Listen, one of the main things I teach, aside from substitute words or thoughts, that means making a word like pamplemousse, which means grapefruit, visible. How do you remember that it means grapefruit? Okay, I visualize the mousse. I could picture a mousse, and I see a bunch of pimples all over the mousse. Pimple mousse, pamplemousse. But how am I going to remember that that means grapefruit in French? Well, as I go closer to that mousse, I see that all these gigantic pimples are really grapefruits. Mm-hmm. That's it. There's no way I'll ever forget it. When I was in Portugal, oh God, so many years ago, with a friend who was bilingual, he spoke Portuguese, and it took me to places that were great in suburbs that tourists didn't go to, where the people only spoke Portuguese. And he said, do you like clams? And I said, yeah, I love them. And he said, taste these. And they were small, I guess typical for that area of the world in Portugal, clams. And they were delicious, and I loved them. And I asked my friend, what is the word for this meal, these clams, in Portuguese? So if you're not with me, I can ask him. And he said the word for these clams is ameijoas. Well, now, how in the world am I going to remember that if I want to order these clams, that the word is ameijoas? Well, it'll take me 100 times longer to tell it to you than that I did it in my mind.
Sure.
All I did was I visualized a gigantic clam coming out of the sea, walking toward me, and it was all dripping with dirt and seaweed, you know, the dirt that comes out of the ocean. And I looked at this clam and I said, what a ameijoas. And I will never again forget that the word for clam in Portuguese is ameijoas. Do you see what I mean, Jonathan?
Yeah, absolutely.
I teach the PEG system. Listen, the sound for 2 in my system is N, and it always will be N. And the sound for 1 is T, and the sound for 3 is M, and et cetera. And I teach this to children. I'm talking about children, 8, 9 years old, in 2 minutes, okay? Because I give them a little memory aid on how to do that. The sound for 1 is T. Visualize a 1 perpendicular, visualize the other. Now, I do this on a piece of paper. I show them, and picture the other one laying on top of it. That forms a T. So you'll never forget that the sound for 1 is T, T or D. Okay, once you know the sounds, for example, the sound for 2 is N, because a typewritten small n has 2 downstrokes, so it's easy to remember that the sound for 2 is N. And I start every word for a card with the first letter of its suit. For example, any spade card, the word for it will be S. Start with an S, the spade. What would the word sun? I visualize the sun. What could that possibly represent to me when I'm thinking of cards? There's only one thing. There are no choices to make here, no imagination involved here once you've made your picture of the sun, because that starts with an S, that spade, and the sound for 2 is N, so it's the 2 spades. That's all it could be. It's that quick. And you can do that with any card in the deck. That's why I have people who write me say, oh, Harry, I'm remembering the shuffled deck of cards now in about 3 minutes, and things like that, because I teach this in my books.
Sure. Yeah. You know, I think it comes down to everybody has their own methods. We had, Nelson Dellis on the show. The world record now, I think, for a deck of cards is something in the vicinity of 24 seconds.
Okay.
It's just a matter of which systems work. It sounds you've adapted the major method, which I've never heard of doing, and it's very clever, to adapt the major method of remembering numbers as sounds to decks of cards, because it is a lot faster. It's very fast. I love that.
A card is numbers,
Yeah, absolutely.
And I've taught the PEG system not for cards particularly. That's not what the world cares about, Jonathan. They want to be able to remember numbers, how to remember the stock prices. I had a guy write a book called Trader Vic. His name was Victor Sperandio. So everybody called him Vic, and it was called Trader Vic because he said he got his first job in the stock market because of my systems, because they were interviewing people. And in those days, there were ticket tapes to see the symbols of companies and things like that. He remembered 1,600 company symbols. He did it for the guy who was interviewing him. The guy said, you got the job, for God's sake.
Incredible.
So that's what people care about, not cards necessarily, unless you're a gambler. I'm not going to worry about that. But my system teaches him, like I say, how to remember numbers of any kind. I had one letter from a guy, I kept it somewhere. He said, oh, Mr. Lorayne, I remembered pi to the 5,000th place using your systems. And I said to him, are you out of your mind? Because he says, can you do that? Of course I can do it, but I ain't gonna. Why in the world would I want to remember pi to the 5,000th place?
Sure.
But, my systems, you can do it. Go ahead and do whatever you like. Yeah. But remembering numbers, one of the things I did when I was running my classes many years ago, because the way I used to work it, people would send a $50 deposit. I think the cost was $250 for 8 lessons at that point, back in the 1960s. And the way it was sold, the way the advertisements were, we will not cancel your check. You come to the first lesson if you want to leave, and if you don't want to get you due for any reason, we will give you back your check. Incidentally, I never gave back a check. But one of the things I did there, I had one of my instructors, his name was Bob Elliott. I had him stand in front. I said, let me demonstrate something for you. We had a blackboard in the back, and I had people call out digits till we had a horizontal row of 25 digits, and then I would look at Bob and say, okay, Bob, can you give us those numbers? And he'd rattle them off forwards from beginning to the end, and then they'd say, okay, big shot, can you do them backwards? And he'd rattle them off backwards. And I said, folks, that's what you will learn to do in the third lesson, which they did.
Incredible. So I think we've gotten our audience salivating enough. What I wanted to ask you, Harry, is if people want to learn about these methods, there are so many books. You've written so many books, so many people after you have written so many books. Where's a good starting point? What 1 or 2 books would you recommend people read? You said you're still perfecting. You're going to write books until you get it right. Where should people start?
Well, that doesn't mean the systems. That means my writing ability, which people tell me is pretty good. I'm a pretty good teacher. You know why? It's another thing that's a whole different area. I told you before, I'm dyslexic. And I once wrote an article, because people asked me to do it, about why are bad things sometimes very good. And I give 2 examples. Number one, I thought when I was a kid I had a terrible memory. And I did when I was a kid, so I devised systems. If it wasn't for the fact that I had a terrible memory, or thought I did, I wouldn't have become who I became in my life. Do you see what I mean? So the bad there was good. The next bad thing is dyslexia. I'm dyslexic. It gets worse as I get older. But my dyslexia worked for me. You know why? It made me a better teacher, Jonathan, because I teach as if everybody's like me. No ambiguities. I wrote my first book on card magic, which it seems has become a legend for some reason, which is fine. It feeds my ego. It's because as I was interested in magic and growing a little older, and I said, wait a minute, what does he mean? I'm talking about the writer. Does he mean hold the deck face up or face down? Does he mean stick this finger in the middle of the deck or that thing? In other words, there were ambiguities, and as I grew older, I said, I think I could do it better, and I did. So there is that article I wrote about sometimes the bad things can become good things. So anyway, you're asking about books. Out there right now, I've written many. They're not all out there. Some of them are out of print. You're interested in a student, you want to get something for your kids that are students, et cetera, Super Memory, Super Student is still out there. Excellent. The most current book, the last one I wrote, is called Ageless Memory. My original title was the Over 40 Memory Book. It's geared toward people with light color hair, Jonathan, gray. Same systems I teach, but I kind of gear them toward older people. How to remember the name of pills and how to remember whether I took one, what I was supposed to, So, but the systems are the same. I'll tell you, if you don't mind me plugging something, go to HarryLorayneMagic.com. You got to spell the name right, of course. HarryLorayneMagic.com and click on Memory Products, and you'll see all the books on that subject that are now available that you can order right from there.
Excellent. And we will put a link to that in the show notes at becomingaSuperhuman.com/podcast. So you guys don't have to worry. Our listeners don't have to worry about getting the spelling right. Is there a Y? Is there an I? We will put those links up there and everyone will get linked up to you. Mr. Harry Lorayne, it has been such an honor and such a pleasure to not only hear your stories, not only learn from you, but also to personally thank you, because without you, I certainly wouldn't have a job. I certainly wouldn't be doing what I love doing, which is teaching people how to read faster and learn more. Because without your work, I don't think someone would have discovered it, and I don't think someone would have put in the time, the 50 years of writing books by hand, to get this information out there so people like me can come and teach it in different ways to different generations.
I appreciate you telling me that, Jonathan. I like the reading thing. One of the things, if you don't have time for this, just tell me. One of the things I'm against is speed reading. And years ago, I had one of the there was a big speed reading company, I don't want to mention names, that said, we'll teach you how to read. It's so important. I had a 12-year-old student of mine, and we had a challenge. And my student closed the book at the same time that the speed reading student closed the book. But here was the point. They were both tested on the information in that book. And the person that did the speed reading got a terrible mark, whereas my 12-year-old student got 100% because he remembered everything.
Yep.
I said they closed the books at the same time. That's a lie. My student went a little longer. The difference is he remembered everything, whereas the speed reading student did not.
And that's exactly where we start in our course. We say, look, forget about speed reading for 3 weeks. For 3 weeks, we're going to learn how to remember.
That's it.
Only then do you have the right to try and read any faster, because if it's going in one ear and out the other, or in one eye and out the ear, it's not going to happen. And to that, we owe you and your methods, which it sounds like have been trickled down to me through various teachers and through various people who've taught me over the years, all originating from you. So I really do appreciate it.
And my pleasure, sir, and thank you for saying so.
Awesome. It has been such a pleasure to have you on the show, Mr. Harry Lorayne, possibly the greatest memory on the planet.
Thank you, sir. Good to talk to you, Jonathan.
Take care. You have a wonderful afternoon.
You too. Goodbye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit www.becomingasuperhuman.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.